interesting that today we did the Athanasian Creed, third Sunday of the month. We haven't changed for, 2 years we've been doing that. And this morning's gospel on Christ confronting the Jews. Last week when I was in St. Paul's, I wound up talking about the obvious and how often we face the obvious and we miss the obvious. Well, this is one of those passages of Scripture where we, again, see the obvious and are completely oblivious to the obvious. I want to set the background a little bit. What we see in this gospel is it's the Feast of the Tabernacles. The Feast of the Tabernacles went something along these lines. Men and the women were separated, golden lamps were present, 4 golden bowls were on each of the lamps. 4 ladders were by them. 4 young men from the priestly group of youths had jugs of oil in their hands containing about 120 logs, and they poured oil from them into the individual bowls. 120 logs is approximately 2 gallons. The wicks were made from the discarded trousers of priests and from their girdles. There was no court in Jerusalem that was not bright from the light of the place of drawing the water. The light symbolized the pillar of fire that protected, guided, and warmed the Israelites during their wandering. And the water was a remembrance of that water that gushed forth from the rock, refreshing the Israelites while they were in the desert. Men of piety and known for their good works danced before the crowd. With torches in their hands, they sang before them songs and praises. The Levites stood with zithers, and somebody can explain to me a zither later, harps and cymbals and trumpets and other musical instruments without number on the 15 steps which led down from the court of the Israelites into the court of the women, which corresponded to the 15 songs of the steps in the Psalms. Now that's the setting. This is what Jesus is walking into as he begins his discussion with this crowd. John chapter 8. Now you really cannot appreciate our gospel this morning unless you engage the entire chapter. You really can't. So I have to give you a brief overview, so bear with me. I'm going to try and do this in 3 minutes. Get your stopwatches out. You ready? Okay. The beginning of John chapter 8, the first 12 verses, Jesus forgives the woman caught in adultery. Notice there's no mention of who that person is. We don't know that it's Mary Magdalene. Okay? That came from Gregory the Great in the 6th century. Actually, almost the 7th century. We just don't know. Notice that only the woman is condemned. According to the Old Covenant, both parties are supposed to be brought to be judged. Notice the guy ain't there. And notice something else. What does Jesus do? He forgives the woman. Who's the only person that can forgive sins? God. Then we move into 13 through 20. Jesus actually bears testimony. He swears by himself. Who's the only other person that we've ever seen in Scripture swear by themselves? Remember the Old Covenant, where God is speaking to Abram, and he says, I swear by myself, by my own name, because there's no other name higher than his by which he can swear. When we swear an oath, we swear an oath to something or on something that is greater than ourselves. There's nothing greater than Yahweh, so he has to swear to himself. You notice what Jesus does? Jesus swears to himself. My testimony is true. And then he adds a little shot. He goes, even if it wasn't, my Father bears testimony of me. But notice something else. The reason that this testimony is true is based on what he said in John chapter 3. Remember what he said to Nicodemus? That whole conversation about being born again? And then he turns around and he says, "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven." Jesus is identifying himself as that one that has descended from heaven. And then Jesus starts to get pointed in his conversation with the Jews and the Pharisees. From 21 through 30, he points out their true nature. They are of sin. This is the Jews. These are the leaders. These are the representatives of the nation of Israel. And Jesus says, you are sin. Then he takes a step back and he says, however, if you knew the truth, if you knew me, the truth would set you free in 31 through 35. And then after that brief refrain, he gets back to discussing who they are with them. And he says, well, you know what your true lineage is? Your true lineage is you're of your father, Satan. So here he steps back and he says, not only are you sinners, but you're sinners because that's all you can be, because you are of your father, the devil. And that brings us to this morning's gospel. Not bad, 4 minutes. What do we see about this gospel that jumps out at us? Now this is Lent, mind you. The epistle this morning is that this man, the Son of God, the God-man, he obtained eternal redemption for us. Obtained. It's a done deal. He purchased it with his blood. Jesus' engagement with these men reminds us of Exodus chapter 3, or at least it should. Moses ascends the mountain and suddenly is confronted by God. He's commanded by God to go to his people. And what does God tell him? When Moses asks, well, great, but who am I supposed to say sent me? And he says, Yahweh, Yahweh. He says, I am the I am. And in the conversation that Jesus has with the Pharisees this morning in this gospel, he confronts them with the nature of their lineage by telling them they are of their true father, Satan. And they say, we are of Abraham. And Jesus tells them, no, if you were of Abraham, you would have rejoiced in my appearance. If you were of Abraham, you would have welcomed me, because Abraham would have reveled in seeing me, because before Abraham was, I am. And they said, give me a break, you're a young man, we know where your father is, he's that carpenter. As a matter of fact, where is your father? And he said, no. He goes, I am the I am. I want you to understand something about that phrase. With the exception of probably 7 or 8 occurrences in the Old Testament, every time that phrase is used, it is used of Yahweh. It is used to reveal the redemptive, the holy, the secret name of God, which reveals his character. He is the Redeemer God. He is the God who draws the people to himself. This is the holy name of God. Over 240 times this is used in that context. This was the name that Jesus ascribed to himself. I don't know if you have ever heard this, but I hear this all the time when people talk about the Lord. Well, Jesus never claimed to be God. It was people that pushed that title upon him. They thrust it. He was just this humble carpenter. They kind of pushed him out there. No, come on. Like we do with politicians. You know, we're trying to do with Rand Paul right now. Yeah, great speech at CPAC. Go run for president. You know, nice job, Jesus. Why don't you be God this week? As if there was a vacancy in the Trinity and there was a for help sign posted out in heaven. That indicates one thing and one thing only. That the people that are talking about Jesus in this manner have no idea who Christ is. And I'm going to say something this morning. If you haven't heard it before, it shouldn't be a shock, but I want you to mark it well. Jesus never opened his mouth. Never opened his mouth where he did not indicate he was God. I challenge you to go back and look at every time Jesus speaks of a parable, and in a parable, every time he engages any man, in any interaction, in any conflict, in any set of circumstances, Jesus is manifesting the fact that he not only is God, but he self-consciously knew he was God. Look at this chapter. What did I describe in this chapter? Only God can forgive sins. Only God can swear by himself. Only God knows the hearts of human beings. And in every single one of those instances, Jesus identified himself as God. I don't have to read a text if I have half a functioning brain that says, "Hi, my name's Jesus. Let me introduce myself to you. I'm God." I don't need to read something like that to know that Christ is God. I'm going to read a couple of things in reference to this phrase that Jesus uses, this phrase that Yahweh used to introduce himself. Just a couple. I'm not going to go through all 240. I have some of the verses. If you're interested, I can give them to you later. But when you see this I am, I want you to think along these lines. That he is the God who appears to his people. He's not a myth. He's not a shadow. Genesis 17. He is the God who comforts his people. Genesis 26:24. He is the God who blesses his people. Pronounces a blessing. He is giving grace. Genesis 31:13. He is the God who guides and protects his people. Genesis 46. He is the God whose holiness should drive us to our faces on the ground. Exodus chapter 3. He is the God who fights for his people. Exodus 7:5. He is the God who separates his people out from sinners. Exodus 8:22. Remember that instance during the plagues of Egypt? Where he says there will be darkness in the land, a darkness that is so thick it can be felt, but there will only be light in the land of Goshen. There will be plagues on their cattle, but your cattle will be protected. God separates his people out. He is the God who will get his glory from unbelievers. Just because people don't glorify him now doesn't mean that they won't. Exodus 14. He is the God who redeems his people. Hebrews 9 this morning. Exodus 20, chapter 2. He is the God who cares for the poor. Leviticus 19. In Leviticus 19, the entire chapter of Leviticus 19 uses this phrase. And he is the God who is jealous of his name. Does it scare you when people blaspheme the name of God? Does it scare you when people malign God's character? It should. You see, this is what Jesus is saying to us in the gospel this morning. He's saying, God is here. I am the second person of the Godhead. I am all those things that I just read to you, and more, and more. When we come to Lent, when we come to this period, and this begins the Passiontide for the next 2 weeks, we face Palm Sunday and then Holy Week. Do we realize what's going on? The obvious stares us in the face. When I get to Easter, I'm going to preach a different sermon than I've preached in the past. The last couple of sermons on Easter, I've preached on apologetics. It's going to be a little different this year. This year, I'm going to tell you why Easter was necessary. And these 2 weeks lead up to that. Jesus looked at that crowd in the midst of this celebration. Think about this conversation in that setting. Dancing, singing, zithers, harps, candles. There's light. And what does he say? I am the light of the world. Excuse me? And you're of your father, the devil. Dude, you're a real killjoy, man. You know how to bring a party down. I'll bet you he wasn't invited back next time. He's standing in their midst on one of their most celebrated feasts. And listen carefully. God himself is telling them that they're going to hell. God himself is telling them that they're going to hell. You claim to be of your father Abraham? You claim to be of the true seed? Then why don't you recognize who I am? I forgive sins. I swear by myself. Hang on a few minutes. I'm going to raise the dead for you, just so that you know. Now go back and read the Gospel of John, and now, in that context, every one of the I am statements by Christ fit into this context. I am the door. Who's the door? God, the second person of the Godhead, Jesus Christ. I am the good shepherd. Who's the good shepherd? God, the second person of the Godhead, Jesus Christ. I am the living water. You drink from me and you'll never thirst again. Not this. This. Who's the living water? God, the second person of the Godhead. And I can go on. I am the true vine. I am the living bread. I am the bread of life. He's not claiming to be divine. Everything out of his mouth shouts, I am divine. And for every second that his followers ignored him or disobeyed him or rejected him, they put their life in peril. As we come and prepare for Palm Sunday, for the celebration, the inauguration of the King in his triumphal entry, let's keep in mind who sits on that foal. Who chose, I gotta be careful, I don't want to give away my sermon for next week. Who chose not to ride on a white stallion, emblematic of the victorious kings in conquest? Who chose to come in humility? Who didn't ask that you make me king? Because he knew he was already king. And now put all of that together and add this phrase. It is the second person of the Godhead doing this for his people. Keep that in mind this Passion time as we approach Easter. Keep in mind that this Passion Week, Jesus is telling us something that we should know as obvious, and that is he is the I Am. And he's been the I Am